Never before in military history had there been a bombardment of this intensity. The entire Allied battle plan was based on the concept that the artillery would give the Germans such a mauling that the troops would merely have to mop up. Why wasn't that the case? The answer lies here. The underlying geology of the Somme makes it a nightmare for a general planning an assault. Chalk is perfect for deep dugouts, capable of resisting the heaviest artillery fire. All along the Somme front, the Germans were in effect defending a chain of subterranean forts some 30 feet deep. No evidence of them has survived, but it is possible to see what a British chalk dugout was like. A section of frontline trench near the village of Thiepval is currently being restored to the condition it was in on July the 1st, 1916. It's from here that men of the Ulster Division sprang forward on the morning of the attack.
We have a brigade commander's bunker here.
So, in fact, it shows that brigade commanders didn't live in chateaux.
Well, they weren't very far behind the front line. We're only maybe less than 70 metres behind the front line here.
They were pretty big, weren't they? And they would have 2 or 3 tier bunks in them.
Oh yes, yes, oh
yeah,
yes.
and office tables and the whole lot.
You can see where it's going to come through here.
Yeah.
Into the communication trench.
It must have taken quite an effort to dig a trench like this using only hand tools, because they didn't have JCBs in those days.
No, they didn't.
So how long would it have taken?
Well, the chalk at this level is not solid chalk. It's only when we go down probably another 5 or 6 feet that we go into solid chalk that you really get into the quarrying part of it. It's pretty fragmented chalk at this level, and although it would have been a very difficult and hard job for them to do it, it's not as difficult as it gets
lower when you go further down.
As you go further down.
The Germans had had nearly 2 years to dig deep. The bombardment caused far less damage than the British hoped, largely because of those deep German bunkers dug into the chalk. Even worse, the barbed wire defences were still mainly intact. One of the key aims of the bombardment had been to tear apart the wire protecting the German trenches. There were 2 techniques: shrapnel, shells that burst in the air, spraying down hundreds of little metal balls to cut the wire, or high explosive shells which blew up after landing. What determines how and when a shell explodes is this, the fuse, which sits on the nose of the shell. As a gunner, I can adjust it to make it explode in the air, on contact with the ground, or having drilled its way deep into the ground first. The air-bursting shrapnel shells, designed to kill troops in the open, proved ineffective at cutting wire. The high-explosive shells buried themselves in the ground, causing little damage to the wire above. What was needed was a shell that exploded immediately on contact in the ground, using what was called a Gray's fuse. Although there were some of these in service, many were defective, exploding prematurely and sometimes killing the gunners. Better Gray's fuse shells were developed later, but not in time to prevent the slaughter on the wire that morning. Far too many of the British shells at the Somme, around 30%, didn't explode at all. They were poorly manufactured, duds. Those plum puddings, the trench mortars, were notorious. On one occasion, the Germans raised a blackboard reading, "Should we send back your unexploded ammunition?" Farmers on the Somme regularly plough up unexploded shells to this very day. How far should the generals be blamed for equipment failure? When I was issued with kit for my troops, I expected it to have been field tested and to work. But good ideas on paper often fail in battle. The troops going over the top that morning carried a strange-looking gadget on the end of their rifles.
We've got the rifle, that's the short magazine Lee Enfield, and especially for the day, got a pair of wire cutters fixed. What happens is you push the wire cutters against the wire, and as these pull back, little levers close up and those jaws clamp around the wire, and that should snip neatly through the wire. It works brilliantly on British wire, just doesn't cut German wire.
It's impossible to judge how well the British generals performed or understand why controversial decisions were made without considering the huge scale of the operation, both in manpower and material.
People always take great interest in the actual fighting. They think that Tommy with his bayonet, that's what it's all about. But actually, you can have the best troops in the world, superbly equipped, brilliantly led, wonderfully trained. But if you can't move them and feed them and resupply them and tend to them when they're sick, you can achieve absolutely nothing. And successful generals are those that understand logistics.
The logistics behind the Somme campaign were complex and brilliantly handled. Establishing the army on the Somme was rather like, in population terms, creating a city the size of Edinburgh. Once everything arrived in France, the problems were just beginning.
Now we are accustomed to think of helicopters and great columns of lorries and track resupply vehicles and all the rest of it. At this period, we haven't yet got a pneumatic tyre, so you have not got a cross-country capability for a wheeled vehicle. So if you want to resupply your army and move all the kit that you need for a huge offensive like the Somme, when you're moving up shells, rations, water, railway track, gravel for roads, all sorts of kit, you're down to horse-drawn, mule-borne transport. The British Army was buying horses all over the world, it was buying mules. The British Army bought something like 400,000 mules as transport animals. 25% of all the shipping coming from England to the Western Front was fodder for all these animals that are pulling your transport wagons and your ambulances and your ammunition columns and everything else. You're actually shipping a greater weight of equine fodder than you are weight of shells.
What about the men? In crude terms, the quality of the human material the generals had to work with. Haig's troops were the product of a hastily organised training programme, designed to turn civilians into soldiers in the shortest time possible. The British Army in 1914 was geared up to recruit and train 30,000 new men every year. Once the call went out for volunteers, the Army received 30,000 men in a single day, more than 1 million in total. It would be like the modern British Army expanding more than tenfold, almost overnight. Unlike the Germans, with 2 years' battle experience, the men Haig commanded at the Somme were for the most part going into action for the first time. Their enthusiasm was beyond question. Their competence would only be rarely tested once the bullets and shells started flying. Would we have won in the Falklands if my men were all essentially amateurs? Probably not. In one branch of warfare, sometimes overlooked in this battle, Haig's men proved to be the best in the business. Long before 0 hour, another extraordinary aspect of this battle was already being played out, deep beneath where I'm now standing. While the Germans were being pounded by shells from above, a top-secret operation was underway to attack them from below. Here again, Allied commanders were pushing the boundaries of warfare with offensive mining on a scale never seen before. The mines required digging tunnels snaking towards the enemy trench line, often 50 to 100 feet deep and stretching for hundreds of yards. At the Somme, there were 17 such tunnels. A chamber was hacked out at the end of the tunnel, into which was packed thousands of sacks of an explosive called ammonal. A team, including ex-military engineers, are exploring remaining British tunnel systems in northern France, exactly like those cut beneath the Somme in 1916.
We're now about 70 feet underground, and this tunnel we're in at present runs parallel to and just ahead of the front line. And off the tunnel, as you see, there are tunnels running towards the German lines which are there. We're entirely in chalk. The geology here is deep and hard chalk. The underlying principles of the structure are much the same.
Building them took great courage and enormous effort.
There were something like 30,000 miners in the mining companies, 3 Canadian, 3 Australian, 1 New Zealand tunnelling company, and the remainder were British. In addition to those miners, there would be perhaps 500 infantry attached to every mining company when it was operating. So you're talking of, at any point of time, perhaps 50,000 men engaged in mining, and the logistic effort was enormous. So the timber needed, the explosives and moving the spoil, etc.
It was vital to keep the location of the tunnels secret right up to 0 hour. Dumping a huge pile of chalk removed from the tunnels anywhere near the entrance would be spotted right away by the Germans.
So they had to remove this well away from the lines and conceal it. They bring it out of the tunnels in sandbags generally, onto light railways and move it back to perhaps old quarries where it could be concealed, or they would put it into shell holes, cover over the top with topsoil. They had to hide it.
The location of the mines remained a secret, right up until the moment of detonation. Set for exactly 7:28. 2 minutes before the troops would go over the top. These mine craters, now filled by water on a northern section of the old front line, give some idea of the size of the explosions which resulted. On the Somme, the craters from July the 1st have since been filled in. All except one.
This is the Lochnagar crater, the largest of the mines blown that day, using 60,000 pounds of ammonal. Imagine the terror and confusion among the German defenders as thousands of tons of earth and chalk were blown into the sky and crashed down again, leaving a hole 80 feet deep and 300 feet across.
The huge mining operation, carried out in secret just yards from the enemy, was a brilliant stroke which caused, as intended, massive casualties on the German side. But one mine was to cause a greater loss to the Allies than the Germans. The Hawthorne mine, near Beaumont Hamel, and containing 40,000 pounds of ammonal, was detonated early, 10 minutes before 0 hour. The plan was that troops would race forward to occupy the crater. In reality, the Germans got there first.
Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the entire day occurred when the Newfoundland Regiment was sent in to try to dislodge them. This unit of roughly 800 men was virtually wiped out.
Most died not as they came face to face with the Germans, but before they'd even reached the British front line. Because the communication trenches behind the front line were blocked by dead and wounded, they were forced to approach above ground.